the rewriting of history, and the Scopes trial, topic 6. In our last topic, I discussed the rewriting of history to try and make it appear as though modern or operational science and Christianity can't mesh, when in reality, it was only within the framework of Christianity that modern science could have evolved. Today, I'd like to share another instance where the rewriting of history is used to attempt to make Christians appear to be ignorant and unlearned. And this example is Hollywood's version of the Scopes trial, Inherit the Wind. What was the Scopes trial? And how does Hollywood's rewriting the truth of this trial make Christians appear to be ignorant and unlearned? Well, if you haven't had the opportunity to watch the 1960 version of Inherit the Wind or the 1999 version of Inherit the Wind, you might want to do that. But when you do, take note, this movie is shown nationwide in our high school classrooms all over this country every single year as educational films in science, history, and social studies. And the students watching this film are usually led to believe that the film was based on true facts, the facts surrounding the infamous Scopes trial. Now, if they're given assignments, they usually write about Reverend Brown or Reverend Brown's daughter. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Who was John Scopes? Scopes was a high school teacher who was, according to Hollywood's version, jailed, fined, and horribly mistreated by the townspeople of Dayton, Tennessee, for daring to teach his students on the topic of evolution. And why did John Scopes teach on the topic of evolution? Well, according to Hollywood's version, because his conscience forced him to, because he felt that his students deserved to know the truth. But what are the true facts of the Scope trial, which is also known as the Monkey Trial of 1925? Let's go through them really quickly. When I mentioned Bryan, Attorney Bryan, he's the attorney defending the Butler Law. Now, the Butler Law was a law Tennessee passed which made it illegal to teach evolution in a school classroom setting. So Bryan was the attorney that represented that. Darrell is Scopes' attorney. Okay, Scopes, who was he? He was a physics and a math teacher and a football coach. He was not a biology teacher. He merely substituted in the biology class for the last 2 weeks of school when the biology teacher themselves was sick. So he's a fill-in teacher in the classroom. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union in New York, had advertised for a biology teacher who would be willing to be a pawn in testing this Butler Law that Tennessee had. And so it wasn't the townspeople who were on the witch hunt, which is how Hollywood's version pictures it. It was the ACLU who started the witch hunt. And the ACLU and George Raplegia, who was a mine owner outside of Dayton, Tennessee, were the ones responsible for indicting John Scopes for teaching evolution in the classroom. The school, the city, the county, the state, they didn't even indict this teacher. The ACLU came in and indicted him for teaching evolution in the classroom, which in reality, Scopes never taught evolution in the classroom. He even skipped the topic while reviewing the students for their final exam. Scopes was never jailed, nor was he prosecuted for his courageous stand on behalf of evolution by religious fanatics, as the film portrays. There was no Reverend Brown, and therefore there obviously was no Reverend Brown's daughter. They're both totally fictitious characters inserted into the film, seemingly with the intention of making Christians look foolish, ignorant, and backward. Yet they are the two most influential people in this film as far as children and youth are concerned. They're the ones, if students are given an assignment, that they most often write about. Reverend Brown even goes so far as to curse his own daughter for not disowning her boyfriend, John Scopes. Well, that didn't happen because they didn't exist, and John Scopes at that point in history didn't have a girlfriend. And the daughter, obviously, since she didn't exist, was not mistreated on the witness stand by Attorney Bryan. Okay, the conservative Christians of Dayton, Tennessee are portrayed as greedy, ignorant, close-minded, and discourteous people. They even behave in a threatening manner towards the defense attorneys, the news media, and outsiders in general. Yet Darrell himself stated, and this is a quote, "I don't know as I was ever in a community in my life where my religious ideas differed as widely from the great mass as I have found them since I have been in Tennessee. Yet I came here a perfect stranger, and I can say what I have said before, that I have not found upon anybody's person, any citizen here in this town or outside, the slightest discourtesy. I have been treated better, kindlier, and more hospitable than I fancied would have been the case in the North." Okay, Attorney Bryan was not ignorant on the teaching of evolution, as Inherit the Wind portrays. In fact, he had written many well-argued articles that were critical of the scientific evidence they were using in that day as proof of evolution. And he had long carried on a conversation, correspondence-wise, writing back and forth, with the famous evolutionist Henry Fairfield Osborn. The same Osborn who made the statement that if a hypothetical, unbiased zoologist from Mars visited our planet, he would classify people into several distinct groups or species. Osborn taught that the darker the person's skin, the less evolved to human status that person was. In contrast, Darrell, Scopes' attorney, gave the impression of having a very poor grasp of both the meaning and mechanisms of evolution. The testimony of the evolutionists who were assembled, who were to be called to testify, witness on behalf of evolution, was prevented because Darrell refused to let them be cross-examined. He said, "I want these witnesses to testify on evolution, but no, I don't want Attorney Bryan to be able to cross-examine my witnesses." And the judges, what? No, if you call them as expert witnesses, he gets to cross-examine them. And because Bryan was going to get to cross-examine them, Darrell decided not to put them on the stand. Okay, the definition of the term evolution was constantly muddled by Darrell, by the defense, to the point that it was very likely that some of the people in the courtroom and the jurors themselves could not tell exactly what he was referring to by evolution. Remember, evolution was not widely taught in the classroom settings in that day. Okay, after spending the 7th day of the trial systematically grilling and ridiculing Bryan for his Christian beliefs, including his belief in the biblical miracles, Darrell abruptly ended the trial by asking the judge to find his client, John Scopes, guilty. There was a purpose for this. Bryan had only agreed to take the witness stand to answer questions on his Christian beliefs if he in turn could question Darrell on his agnostic and atheistic beliefs. But when Darrell asked the court to find his client guilty, that stopped everything. Bryan was never allowed to question Darrell on his beliefs that there was no God, and neither was he allowed to give his closing argument, which was a very well-supported scientific and religious argument against the theory of evolution. In the movie, Inherit the Wind, when his client is found guilty, Darrell is visibly shaken by this great injustice. He's the one that asked the court to find him guilty. And yet he's, that my client was found guilty. Brian, on the other hand, is vindictive and argues bitterly that the $100 fine, which was a lot of money back then, the $100 fine levied against Scopes was not near enough for the great magnitude of the crime that he had committed. In reality, all of Scopes's expenses were covered by various interests, and a future tuition was given to him. As soon as the trial finished, he was given the money to get a graduate degree in biology. So he never spent any time in jail. He wasn't persecuted. The trial didn't cost him a single penny, and he got a free graduate degree by allowing himself to be the pawn in testing the Butler Law. The entire purpose for the trial was to declare the Butler Law unconstitutional, to expose fundamental Christian views on the subject of origins to public ridicule, and to focus the attention of the world on evolution. Most people didn't have a clue what it was at that point. After that trial ended, they did. Never did Attorney Brian lose his senses while in the courtroom and begin ranting crazily from the stand. They have him up there reciting, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Exodus. But he can't even say the books of the Bible in order. He's so, just so acting so crazy. Okay? And he didn't fall dead on the courtroom floor, as they show. He died 5 days later while resting peacefully in his own bed while sleeping. The Christian fundamentalists in the movie are constantly lampooned, and while the skeptics and agnostics are constantly portrayed as the intelligent, kindly, and even heroic people. Now, the authors of Inherit the Wind obviously did not intend to write a historically accurate account of the Scopes trial, but that's how it's presented every year in the hundreds of classrooms nationwide where this movie is shown. Okay? Besides the rewriting of history to make Christians who believe in the biblical version of creation seem ignorant and unlearned, and evolutionists seem intelligent, there are many other side effects to allowing Darwin's theory as fact. In 1925, when the Scopes trial enabled the widespread entrance of evolution into our school systems, the character of the classroom began to slowly change. This moral decline didn't happen overnight because it takes time for moral decadence to work its way into mainstream culture. And what could the teaching of evolution possibly have in common with the moral decline of society? Consider what this theory teaches. Man is an accident. He came from nowhere. He's going nowhere. And life is a point of pain in a meaningless existence. For someone who swallows evolution as fact, why not have fun? Why not do what you want to do, regardless of whether it hurts other people, before you become just another pile of dust on the earth? I want to leave you with this question. Why do you think the world feels it necessary to belittle someone who believes in the biblical story of creation? Thank you for joining me today.